Chess YouTube, the entire chess world is in a state of total and complete meltdown over what Magnus Carlsen just did to the Indian prodigy Arjun Erigaisi. This is round number 4 of the 2025 Norway Chess Tournament, and Magnus here, we all know he's good. We all know he's the GOAT. But in this game, he just shows no mercy and shows his true power here. All right, in the game, Magnus, playing as white, opens 1c4, the English opening, gaining control of d5. And now here, Arjun, he plays the copycat variation with the move 1c5, heading for the symmetrical English. Now here, Magnus, g3, intending bishop g2 here, but Arjun, g6, he continues to copy Magnus. We have bishop g2, bishop g7, knight to c3, knight to c6. Here, so far, Arjun literally content to just copy every single move of the GOAT. But here, Magnus makes a move that basically forces Arjun to respond somehow. He plays the move rook to b1. Now, this move looks like sort of a beginner move. After all, white here potentially intending a3 and b4, which is one idea, but it doesn't really fight for the center of the board. However, because the center here is so closed, because neither side has really pushed their center pawns here, Magnus can go for this sort of flank idea on the flank of the board. All right, now Arjun, he responds, knight to f6, maybe intending short castles, and finally, we do have the symmetry being broken in this game. Now Magnus continues. a3, a very logical idea, intending b4, trying to gain space, and if he gets that move in, he'll have some pressure on c5, and white may be able to trade his flank pawn, the b pawn, for the c pawn, which would increase his control of the center of the board. And beyond that, white could also go, say, bishop b2, challenging black's very important bishop on g7. So overall, this sort of flank idea does make a lot of sense. Now here, Arjun, he knows this, and he shuts it down immediately with the move a5. The point being, now if white goes b4, black just takes, and then takes, if I can draw arrows correctly, takes, and he does win that pawn on the b4 square. So, for now, b4 is shut down, but the drawback of the move a5, it weakens the a4 and the b5 squares, and that means ideas like knight to a4 or knight b5 later in the game could be very, very strong. Now, Magnus, he continues. d3, a logical move, opening up the scope of the bishop on c1. Very good. And now Arjun, e6. Now, this right here is a very double-edged move. On the one hand, it does give black the idea of going d5. Again, trying to fight for control of the center of the board. Now, the problem with this move, it weakens the dark squares. After all, black already went g6 and bishop g7. And typically when you do that, you don't want to go e6 as well, as then all of these squares on the king side and the center become a lot weaker. All right, now here, Magnus, we have knight f3, castles, and then Magnus, bishop to e3. Very interesting. More normal here is bishop f4, or perhaps b3, bishop b2, and so on. But on e3, the bishop does attack the c5 pawn, so black here is going to have to respond. Now Arjun, queen to e7, he defends with the queen. Sort of an unusual square for the queen, but very logical overall. And now Magnus, he jumps in with the knight to the a4 square, one of those weakened light squares on the queen side, with the move knight to a4, pressuring c5. Now, keep in mind, if black went, for example, a6 instead of a5, then black could go b5 later, trying to force off that knight off the a4 square. However, because black went a5, that knight on a4 is now permanently cemented there, as if black ever goes b5, white just takes the pawn. So now black has to do something about the pressure on the c5 square. In the game, black goes d6. Now, to be honest, if black wanted to go d6, then he probably shouldn't have played this move e6. So overall, the engine does show black is doing fine here, but Magnus finding ways to make black's life just a little bit more difficult, forcing some weird-looking pawn moves. All right, now Magnus, he castles. Black goes rook to b8, intending potentially b5 ideas. This makes a lot of sense. After all, if Arjun is not going to go d5 or e5, then seeking counterplay on the queen side with a move like rook b8, intending b5 does make a lot of sense. And here, Magnus, he's got a few ideas. For example, if he wants to stop the b5 advance for now, then a move like knight b6 could be played. And that is actually pretty strong here. But instead, Magnus decides, you know what? It is time to counterattack in the center. And he goes for the central break, d4. Now, Stockfish says this move right here is not the most accurate move in the world. However, it does work out very well in the game. And black has to find like a really, really precise move here to maintain the edge after this slight inaccuracy. Now, the best move for black, it turns out, according to Stockfish, is b6, supporting the pawn on c5 like this. Now, instead, in the game, black takes on d4, and it turns out this does help white. White recaptures with the knight. Then we have one more trade. Knight takes d4, and then bishop takes. And now suddenly, Magnus gets sort of this pleasant position that he was going for all along from the opening. After all, his bishops on d4 and g2 have a lot of scope. He's got a little bit more space in the center here. Thanks to his pawn on c4, black's pawns on b7 and a5 are a little bit weak. And, you know, black overall is very solid. He may be intending, for example, bishop d7, then c6, trying to activate his bishop. But Magnus still gets that slight pressure that he wanted out of the opening phase of the game. Now, what is Arjun going to do about it? Well, obviously, one idea is this classic idea of bishop d7, then c6, which black plays a lot in the Catalan opening. Now, instead, in the game, black goes b5, and it turns out this is actually even stronger than the other plan. Black here making full use of the rook on b8, fighting for counterplay, and if the center opens up, then the knight on a4 might be looking a little bit misplaced, and beyond that, if the b file opens up, this rook will be very active on the semi-open b file. Now here, white does take on b5, we have c takes b5, then rook takes, and then knight to c3. So white understands his knight on a4 was a little bit misplaced, so you want to bring it back to the c3 square, pressure the rook, force it back, and so on. So, in the game, rook to b8 played, excuse me, the rook does retreat, and now white, queen to a4, the queen flies out and just pressures this pawn. Again, a typical Magnus move, just pressuring a pawn and asking black, okay, what are you going to do about it? How do you want to defend? But Arjun, this guy, as you all know, he's kind of a madman at the chessboard. Now, why would a madman play the, symmetrical English copycat variation leading to this position? I'm not completely sure, but anyways, heading back to the main game here, queen to a4, Arjun plays basically a madman's move. He plays the move bishop b7. Now, this move, if white wants it, he can just take on b7 and then take on a5 like this, and that is a clean pawn. White just wins a pawn, and there's really nothing black can do about it. And you know what? Magnus Carlsen, he came ready for a fight. In this position, he just takes on b7, then on a5. He takes with the bishop. Black takes back with the queen, and then queen takes a5, wins that pawn on the a5 square. However, Arjun, not to be outdone, he also got exactly the position he wanted. He plays the move e5, pushing those pawns down the board. The bishop goes back to e3, and then Arjun d5, threatening the move d4 here, at which point he would fork the knight and the bishop. So Arjun giving up that pawn on the queen side, and Arjun here is burning the bridges metaphorically. He's going all in on the attack, because if this game reaches an endgame, let's say literally every piece comes off the board, the queens come off, the rooks come off, and so on, white is just completely winning. These outside pass pawns will decide the game. Therefore, Arjun, he is all in. If this is poker, every chip is on the table. He has to win with the attack in the middle game, or at least get some sort of other advantage based on the attack. Otherwise, he is going to be smoked in this game. All right, Magnus, he knows d4 is coming. With that in mind, bishop g5 is the move, the only good square for the bishop. If you go back to, say, d2 or anywhere else, you are in deep trouble. Trust me on that. So, bishop g5 played in the game. Arjun, he continues. d4, hitting the knight on c3. The knight's got to go somewhere now. Now here, before moving the knight, of course, the knight, you would love to go to one of these central squares. However, if you go to either of those squares right away, then the knight on f6 takes the knight and wins the game. So what Magnus does here, he takes on f6. Now, this is a very, very double-edged decision. What he's doing here, he's giving up his precious dark-squared bishop. Black's bishop on g7 will now become a monster after bishop takes. But what he gets in return for that, he now has access to d5 and e4 potentially with the knight. So Magnus here, knight d5. The knight jumps in, pressures the bishop, and yes, black can technically go back to, say, g7, but white would still have ideas there. Now, instead, again, Arjun, bishop g7 is the natural move. It's a move I would play in half a heartbeat, but Arjun has some different ideas in mind. He plays bishop g5. Okay, this is so interesting. Why would you go to g5 instead of g7? Well, g7 is a more defensive square. You support e5 and so on, but beyond that, the bishop really isn't doing that much. However, on g5, it controls the c1 square as well as d2, stopping ideas like rook c1 or queen d2, and black may want to go rook to c8 next, intending an infiltration on the c file. So, this move is way more active, but on the downside, it does weaken the pawn on e5 and, in general, these dark squares on the long diagonal. So, very, very double-edged decision. You gotta love it by Arjun. All right, now Magnus, as usual, he finds the best move here. Knight to b4. He retreats the knight, maybe intending something like, say, knight to d3, pressuring e5. Basically, just trying to find a better overall square for the knight. And beyond that, he also temporarily blocks the b file, therefore limiting black's pressure on the semi-open b file here. Now, here, Arjun. Bishop to d2. Wow. Did he see this idea when he went bishop g5? Did he say, you know what, Magnus is likely going to go knight to b4, therefore I need the bishop on g5 to go to d2 to pin the knight to the queen? If he saw that, Arjun, I mean, that is some 2800 ELO chess right there. All right, now, the problem with this move, it does give up the e5 pawn, but if white takes it, black can take on b4, and after a takes, take on b4 again and win that pawn. And sure enough, that is what happens here. So, if queen takes, bishop takes, a takes, queen takes. So, let's slow down and do inventory. Magnus here is starting to pull away with the advantage. Now, Arjun has a lot of counterplay. His queen is very active. His rook here on the b file, very active. And he can likely go, say, rook to e8 or d8 in the near future, maybe push this pawn and so on. And black will have attacking chances, especially considering how weak the light squares are on the king side. However, a pawn is a pawn. Magnus here up the b pawn, I guess, the b pawn or the e pawn versus the d pawn. So Magnus here, again, if he can consolidate and just trade off some pieces, he should have at least a tiny edge as the game progresses. All right, Magnus, rook f d1, pressuring d5. And black here, rook f to e8. He ignores the defense of the pawn on d4. What is the idea? Well, here it's simple. If white takes here, and then black takes and white takes, then black swoops in, rook takes e2, threatening the pawn on b2, and that pawn would be as good as gone, as there would be no way to defend it, and black would equalize. Therefore, white cannot take on d4 with the queen. He's got to do something else. So instead, queen to f4 played. Magnus finding a subtle way to maintain the tension. The point being, if black takes on e2, which by the way, Arjun did in the game, rook takes e2, then the idea is rook takes d4, not queen takes. Now, with the rook taking, this means more major pieces are being left on the board, and therefore Magnus will have potentially more chances to just sort of pressure black in this endgame, middle game scenario, and maybe force out an unforced heir. All right, now here, the best move for black is queen to b3. As they say, passed pawns must be blockaded, but instead Arjun, queen to b7. Now, this shouldn't be that big of a deal, but to be honest, I mean, any little edge you give Magnus is going to come back to haunt you, and queen b3 in that position, according to the engine, was a much more precise move. Now Magnus finds a very good idea, queen to f6, pressuring the weak dark squares, threatening ideas like rook to e8, and of course, if this rook ever gets off the back rank, if it could teleport to, say, b3, then rook to d8 would lead to checkmate on the back rank. So, white setting up some potentially very dangerous ideas, and white may even want to threaten at some point h4, h5, h6, and then queen g7. So white here, white really has some threats building up. All right, black, what should he do? It turns out the best move here for black is actually the alpha zero move h5, intending h4, h3 potentially with threats on g2. Now instead, black goes rook to e6, trying to swat away the queen like a fly swatter, but it turns out this move here is weak due to tactical reasons. And here Magnus finds the best move, of course, and he starts to pull away with the lead. Rook to d8. The rook goes in to the back rank, forces the black rook off one way or another. Here Arjun does take on d8. White takes back as well. We have king g7, then queen d4 hits the king to g8, and now b4. The march of the passed pawn has begun, and It's important to note, in these endgames with just the rooks, it's sort of a 50-50 scenario of whether or not white has enough material to win. The side with the extra pawn in the rook endgames, he has some chances to win, but it's not necessarily completely obvious if he'll win or not. Now, with the queens on the board, that is a completely different scenario because there's so much more firepower. In this case, Magnus is really in the driver's seat and really has good chances to actually win. All right, black, h5 is the move, threatening potentially h4, h3. Let's see how it goes. White, b5, pushing the pawn down the board, and now we have rook b6, black trying to blockade the pawn. All right, rook to e1, white giving up the pawn, but of course the idea is if you take the pawn, then it's checkmate in two moves. Rook to e8, king to h7, and then queen to h8 would be checkmate. So that pawn on b5, of course, is poisoned. You simply can't take it. So instead, queen to b8 guards the back rank, stopping rook to e8 ideas in its tracks. Now, here, white actually goes rook to e8 anyway. The idea is very simple. After queen takes b6, wins the rook, which happens in the game. Queen takes, and now this pawn on b5 is basically uncontested and has good chances to just march down the board. All right, queen to e1 hits the king, king g2, queen to e4 hits the king to f1, queen d3 again, king to e1, queen c3, king e2, and here Magnus knows if he just goes back and forth with his king there, the queen can just kind of give checks forever on, say, e4 and e1. Therefore, the only way to really secure winning chances here is to march the king down the board. Now, this could be a risky call, but Magnus here, being the GOAT, has it all worked out. So, here's how it goes. Queen c2 hits the king e3, queen c3, king e4, queen c4, king e5, king g7, h4, queen d3. Now, Magnus here, his plan is just to bring his king over to the queen side here. Kings can't go that way, but over to the queen side here, and he's going to be winning. So, queen c5, queen to f5 check, king to d6. And in this position, Arjun Erigaisi is forced to resign on the spot to Magnus Carlsen, and this was not a bad call. White here, according to Stockfish, is beyond winning. It is just completely hopeless. The king is going to have shelter on the queen side one way or another. The queen on c5 defends f2. There are no weaknesses. There's nothing to attack. And this pawn will go marching down the board, and black will be toast. Wow, what a game by Magnus. Showing no mercy against the Indian prodigy Arjun Erigaisi. What an incredible game from round 4 of the 2025 Norway Chess Tournament, which is happening right now, by the way. If you're not watching these games during Norway Chess, this is it's Magnus Carlsen's home turf. It's one of the biggest tournaments of the year. You simply have to watch these games right here. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, comment down below what you thought. And as always, I wish you the best of luck on your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.